Hello, my name is Monica Hockenbrock, and I will be doing a presentation on the Paralympics. Please fill out the attached form at the end of the presentation. I just thought it would be a good discussion for us when we come to the Skype session. There's 4 questions that kind of touch on some topics in this presentation. The objectives in this presentation are we're going to look at the history of the Paralympic Games, discuss the differences between Special Olympics and the Paralympics, look at how the games are organized and run, look at how the classification system that classify the athletes, and then also look at some current issues and topics facing Paralympics and the athletes. And just to start off, I kind of wanted to show you, it's just an introduction to the Rio Games, but I actually thought it was quite well done.
Yes, I can, suddenly, yes, I can. Gee, I'm afraid to go on as turned into, yes, I can. Take a look, what do you see? 133 pounds of confidence in me. Got the feeling I can do anything, yes, I can. Something that sings in my blood is telling me, yes, I can. I was just born today, I can go the way, yes, yes, I can. 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 Hey, yes, I can.
No, you can't. Yes, I can!
Are you ready? I can climb Everest. Yes, I can. I can fight here all night and never rest. Yes, I can. I was just born today. I can go all the way. Yes.
I just thought that was kind of a good introduction, kind of showed you all the different types of impairments that are present in the Rio and all the Paralympics, but also just kind of showed you the positivity that can come from these games. What we're going to talk about next is the history of the Paralympics. In 1888, the first sports clubs for the deaf were established in Berlin. And that's really one of the first clubs that came around, but really what started the Paralympic movement actually came out of World War II, when there was such a large number of injured war vets and civilians, and in order to meet their needs, they came up with the idea of using sports, kind of more started out as a therapy for these disabled individuals. And this started in 1944 by Dr. Ludwig Gutmann, and what he did was opened a spinal cord center at the Stoke Mandeville Hospital in Great Britain. And this was total care for the individuals, psychotherapy, pre-vocational. And basically what he did was he helped with the rehab sports which led them to doing recreational and competitive. He kind of started that brainchild to move towards the Paralympic movement. And then on July 29th, 1948, what he started then, in order to help these spinal cord injured servicemen and women and civilians, was he started the Stoke Mandeville Games. And it was for wheelchair athletes. And the first one only involved 16 servicemen, and it was just in archery. But then in 1952, the Dutch ex-servicemen joined the games, and then it became known as the International Stokes Mandeville Games. And this Dr. Gutman, he established the first rules, the classifications for this game, and a committee. And then in 1952, they kind of kept that game going with 130 athletes. Then in 1960s, his games were still going on, but they became the Paralympic Games, and they took place in Rome, Italy. And then since 1960, the games have taken place every 4 years. In 1960, the International Working Group on Sports for the Disabled was established, as well as the International Sports Organization for the Disabled. And when our Skype session we can talk, there's so many acronyms with so many different agencies that kind of filter and feed into the Paralympics. It was kind of a lot to sort through, so I just kind of picked out some of the more important names and ones that are the most prevalent in the Paralympics. But there's so many different organizations that feed into this elite athlete movement across the countries. And then in 1976, the first Winter Paralympic Games were held in Sweden. And as I think some of us know, the Paralympic Games take place in the same cities and venues as the Olympics. And that's due to the agreement between the International Paralympic Committee, the IPC, we'll talk a little bit about them later, and the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. And what all this kind of resulted in at the end, which is still going on, it's the International Sporting Organization for the Disabled. And that's kind of the governing body. And like I said earlier, there are some other disability-minded agencies that kind of came out of this Mandeville Games. We have the Cerebral Palsy International Sports and Recreation Association in 1978, and the International Blind Sports Federation in 1980. And then they helped organize the games in 1982, and that was called the International Co-Coordinating Committee for the Disabled. But then, after all these different acronyms, people in and out different committees, on 1989, on September 27th, the International Paralympic Committee was founded, and that is out of Dusseldorf, Germany, and that's, to this day, the organization that does organize and oversees these Paralympic Games. And what the Paralympic Games, from the Greek preposition para, which means beside or alongside, and basically it's saying it's alongside or beside the Olympics. And here is just a quick little video that just kind of talked about the Mandeville Games, just to kind of get you a little more knowledge.
The Paralympic movement started with injured service members post-World War II. Sir Ludwig Gutmann found at Stoke Mandeville Hospital that people were sitting around that had spinal cord injuries, and he said, no more, and realized that physical activity was important in the rehab process for a couple of reasons. One, just the physical side of it in terms of being healthy and decreasing secondary medical conditions. But two, maybe more importantly, the mental side of it, making young men and women that were physically disabled realize that they could still accomplish things and still be successful, and it started with something as simple as sport. Sir Ludwig Gutmann escaped from Germany and was a doctor at Stoke Mandeville Hospital outside of London. And, he basically was walking through the wards and saw a bunch of very heroic young men and women that were laying in beds, and he just wasn't going to have anything like that anymore. And he determined that, your life isn't over. You're 22, 23, 24 years old, and you have a spinal cord injury, but that doesn't mean your life is over. And it was him who really instituted a program at Stoke Mandeville focused on physical fitness and rehabilitation that was the founding of the movement.
But as early as 1956, my father, who started the games at Stoke Mandeville, said he dreamt of the time when people with disabilities would take part in the Olympic Games.
Everything London did, I think, addressed the history of the movement, but then went so far behind it to catapulting the movement into something that is pretty incredible and creates a great opportunity for all of us to figure out how to continue to grow this movement. But London, going home to London and thinking about our own team with 20 injured service members on it was historic.
That was just kind of gave you a brief little history of actually where all the Paralympic movement started. And as I was saying about now, the International Paralympic Committee is the one they oversee the Paralympics. It's known as the IPC, and it is the counterpart of the International Olympic Committee. And it's the global body that overlooks the games. And the members that are involved are the National Paralympic Committees, the NPCs, the regional councils, the international federations, the IFs, and the international organizations of sports for the disabled. And they oversee both the summer and winter games. And they're also responsible for other world and regional championships in 13 sports. Now we're going to go into more on how they're developed, but there are some trends that are more prevalent in the Paralympic Games, and I just wanted to focus on, when I did my research, there was 3 areas. And one was the classification of athletes. Another was the inclusion of the Paralympic athletes in the Olympics and the use of assistive technology. And then there's also some trends too that I wanted to touch on about the one article I found was unequal participation of women compared to men. Female athletes only make up 25% of the Paralympic athletes. And these women participate in fewer sports than the men and have been excluded from sports such as football and rugby and have just started powerlifting. And it says more women participate in the Western world. And the reason that this article, when they researched, found was it often comes from the division of the age, the social class, the sexuality, the religion, race, and their ethnicity. And a lot of times women outside the Western world often lack the opportunity to participate in these sports activities. And I did think this was kind of an interesting topic, and they did say that more research was needed, but it does give you something to look at as far as, 25% versus 75 is quite a difference. Another topic in Paralympics is the inclusion in disability sports. And the debate is if the disabled athletes should be allowed to participate in mainstream sports such as the Olympics and the Commonwealth Games. And from what I read a few different things from the books and some articles. There's really no agreement. And there have been a few athletes who participated in the Olympics in 1948, 1952, and 1984. And those, they won medals in archery and dressage. And some of the more recent are Marla Rudin. She was a blind athlete from the USA who made the finals in the 1500 meters at the 2000 Olympics. And Natalie Dutoif of South Africa, and she was an amputee swimmer who qualified for the 10K open water swim at the 2008 Beijing Olympics. Basically, the inclusion is how the impact of inclusion, how it impacts the Paralympics and how it impacts them in the Olympics, how it impacts the visibility in our world, and extent, honestly, to which they can compete against non-disabled athletes. But that is an ongoing discussion. And probably this feeds into the next part, which is the debate and the use over different technologies and assistive devices with disabled athletes. And what I found was the microfiber, carbon fiber, prosthetics that you see a lot of the runners wearing. An example is that Oscar, I believe he was called the Blade Runner. And the debate is if these technologies and devices give the disabled athlete an advantage over a non-disabled athlete. And also, too, I found when I was reading some things, if these devices give these people who have access to this technology, if that kind of hinders people who, more kind of like the common athlete who don't have access to these technologies, and does it really impact? And what I found interesting was these technologies and these devices are often compared to performance-enhancing drugs in sports and a potential form of cheating. And then one of the bigger things I found was the trends in classification with how athletes are put in different events. They want the International Paralympic Committee to look at other ways to disability-specific classification because it's very complicated, and we'll talk about it later, but it took a lot to weed through. Before 1990, the classification was done by grouping athletes by their similar impairment, like deaf, blind, loss of limb, and I guess the scheduling nightmare was horrible with this one. So in 1992, they moved to look at sports-focused classification and looked at how these Paralympics and athletes could perform in their sport rather than their impairment. So you could have, basically what they're saying is someone, they might have different disabilities, but their ability in the sport is similar, so they might compete against each other. They wanted to now look at the bodies of the athletes as effective rather than defective, but this is still a lack of agreement on how really these athletes should be classified. And basically what this came down to, the athletes would compete against others who might not necessarily have the same impairment, but would be in the same skill level. This helps limit the number of events and speeds up competition and lessen the confusion in swimming, especially. That's what I noticed. But it definitely doesn't solve all the problems. And here are some disadvantages that it wasn't just swimming, but this was the example they gave that with this new classification system, some athletes can't compete. The tests they're used are sometimes not valid, and it might seem as a punishment if these athletes train hard and are moved into a higher class. Example they gave was for the Paralympics, the 100-meter finals. There was 15 of them for men, 11 for women, and only one race in the Olympics. Just showing how the classification system makes it a lot more harder to organize. And for the Paralympics, an event must have at least 6 competitors from 4 countries. And what happened with this was this affected the number of severely impaired individuals. If someone else was not on their level or did not have the same skills, oftentimes their races were canceled. And this leads to the big question, do we do impairment-specific classification or sports-specific? And what I guess I never really thought about was how the Special Olympics and Paralympics differ and what they have the same. And there's really, they differ in 3 different main areas, and the first one being the athletes. For Special Olympics, you can have any skill level of training. They offer 32 Olympic sports, 8 years or older. You must have an intellectual disability, a cognitive delay, or developmental disability. And that is similar with the Paralympics, but as we get in later, you'll see how the Paralympics differ. And the Paralympics has 10 categories of impairment, and they must meet certain qualifying standards. The other way the Special Olympics and Paralympics differ are their philosophies. In Special Olympics, it's basically doing your personal best and empowering the individuals. It's not not so much that you have the fastest time or the best time, that you're just empowering yourself. Where the Paralympics, you must have a certain sports criteria, and the rules and stipulations that we'll talk about are determined by the IPC, and they want more sports excellence and more of an elite type sporting event. And then lastly, the one is the structure. The Special Olympics have an international board in DC, and they have programs in 170 countries, where the Paralympics are run by the IPC. They're ran out of Germany, and they're made up of a General Assembly governing body, and they have 176 nations. Okay, so now we're going to kind of go into how you can participate in the Paralympics, and then what the sporting events are, and kind of go into a little more detail. To be a Paralympian, you must have a physical, visual, or intellectual impairment. There are 10 eligible impairment types, and there are 8 types of physical impairments and 3 components to the visual impairment. And then there's also the intellectual impairment, which kind of crosses over with the Special Olympics. But you have to have been diagnosed before the age of 18, and you must include intellectual functioning and adaptive behaviors. So I'll just kind of quickly go over the 8 physical impairments. Impaired muscle power. Muscles of one leg, side, or lower half of body is reduced, and that's usually due to spinal cord, spinal bifida, or polio. Next is range of movement. It's impaired, one or more of the joints, but what I found with this one was arthritis is not included in that description. The next physical impairment is loss of limb or limb deficiency. It's a total or partial absence of the bones or joint due to amputation. And then leg length difference, the bone shortening in one leg, and it's usually due to trauma or congenital deficiency. The next one is short stature, where your height is reduced due to shortened legs, arms, and trunk, and it's usually due to muscle skeletal deficiencies of bone and cartilage. Then the next ones we kind of get into the cerebral palsy ones. We have hypertonia, abnormal muscle tension, it's injury, disease, or central nervous system, such as CP. Ataxia, again, is the coordination from a lot of times that's due to cerebral palsy. And the athesis, it's the unbalanced movement. Your posture is off. And again, that's due a lot of times to cerebral palsy. So those are the 8 physical impairments. And then to have a visual impairment, athletes range from partial blindness to legally blind to total blind. And oftentimes these athletes will use sighted guides and consider it as a team. And I found it interesting, their guides actually receive the medals as well. But there's 3 things that one or more components of the eye are damaged, such as the structure, receptors, the nerves or optic pathways, or the visual cortex. And lastly, the intellectual impairment, which does cross over, again, like I said, to Special Olympics, but with Paralympics, it's more of an elite athlete they're looking for. You must be diagnosed before the age of 18, being an elite athlete, must be limited in intellectual functioning, and limited adaptive behaviors, which I just put in there, which would be with your communication skills, your daily living, your socialization, your motor skills, and your possible maladaptive behavior index skills. So now we're going to look at how they kind of organize the sports systems for the games. It was founded in 2003, and it's known as the Code of Classification, and it's used to determine the eligibility and grouping of athletes. It's also used to promote fair play, the right of athletes, and allow protests and appeals. So it's their whole structure on how the games are organized. And an interesting thing is an athlete, they can be eligible in one sport but not in another. And you'll see why at the end. There's different criteria for each sport. And the impairment, in order for them to participate, must lead to permanent and verifiable activity limitation. And as I said, the classifications will differ by sport. And in order to be classified, they are given a physical assessment, a technical assessment, and an observational assessment. And these are done by the international federations. And what these federations do is get together and decide what disability types their sports will include. Example, goalball, which was in that video, is only for visually impaired. And they have to wear eye guards, but the specific disability for certain sports. Some sports are open to athletes in all 10 impairment groups, and one of those was like the track and field events was more so. And they decide how severe of an impairment has to be in order to participate, and it has to impact their performance. And the categories put these athletes together depending on how their impairments affect their ability to participate in a given sport. Can include one or more impairment type. And they compete against athletes in their own sports class, and we'll talk in the next few slides to make it a level playing field. Some sports only have one class, such as powerlifting, and other sports allocate points to each player, and they cannot have over a certain number of points on the field. And that the disabled individuals are given points, so they can only have so many individuals with this impairment or this severe impairment. And we'll talk about that because that comes up, I think, in floor volleyball and some other events. The athletes, to determine their sports classes, are given an evaluation from the classifiers. And the classifiers usually have a medical background or have experience in their given sport, such as ophthalmology, psychologists, just have some background. And this classification takes place before the competition is even started. And you might have to go through this multiple times in their sports career. And the classes, it's a physical, visual, or intellectual kind of assessment they're given. And now, since we talked about the sports classes and the classification, I took the Summer Olympics, Paralympics, and kind of just broke it down because I thought it was interesting to see how they classify each sport, and really how they are broken down and just the complexity of it. I kind of tried to water some of this out. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, but it was just, there's quite a, trying to organize it would be very difficult. So for archery, it's just a physical impairment sport, and they do have 3 classes. Athletics, which is 3 classes for visual impairment and 1 for intellectual. And then we have the bocce, and there's 4 classes for physical impairment, and they're all in wheelchairs. And usually it's either the physical, visual, or intellectual impairment. Those sports is what they focus on. And cycling can be physical and visual impairment. And it was interesting here, depending on the severity, you can use hand cycles, tricycles, or bicycles, or a tandem bike, which is used for the blind. We also have equestrian, which is physical and the visual impairments, and there are 5 classes. And then there's football, 5 on a side, and football, when they're saying football, it's soccer. And it's a visual impairment, and so the 5 on the side, soccer, is just for people with visual impairments, and they wear shades, and they do have a sighted goalkeeper. Now, football 7 aside is physical impairments, and usually what they said, this was associated with cerebral palsy, and there's 4 classes, and you have to have a certain number of players from each class, and each person, depending on their disability, is given a point or a number, and they can only total, when they put those players on the field, they can only have so many points. Is kind of how they do that. Goalball, which is what we saw in the video, and that's visual impairment, and they wear eye shades. Judo, visual again, blind or low vision. And powerlifting is mostly physical, and it's a lower limb, legs or hips, and they compete in different weight categories. And then rowing was another one where they have different classes. It's physical and visual. There's 3 classes, and they compete against rowers in the same class, but there's 4 different events. We also have sailing, which is physical and visual, and they can compete with a crew of 3, 2, or a single boat. And kind of, again, it always comes to these points, and they cannot go above 14 points of different disability point rankings in a boat. Shooting is a physical impairment with 2 classes, and a lot of that is lower limb impairment. Sitting volleyball was a physical impairment, 2 classes, and what I thought was interesting with this, they have minimally disabled and disabled, and you can only have 1 minimally disabled and 5 disabled players on the court. Swimming, which swimming had so many different levels. It had classes of S, SM, and SB, and it's different types of strokes, and there's multiple different categories and subclasses. And then another one was table tennis, and it was for the physical and intellectual. There's 1 to 10 classes for physical impairments that include both wheelchair and standing, and 1 class for students or for individuals with intellectually disabled. Again, wheelchair basketball uses the points, and it's usually a physical. In the video, it showed them in wheelchairs. There are 8 classes, and basically it goes from most severe or most impaired to less impaired, and it goes from 1 to 4.5 scale, but you can only have a total of 14 points on the court at all times. Wheelchair fencing is physical, and that's 2 classes. And then if you see rugby as 7 different classes, kind of the same setup as basketball. And you can only have 8 points on there as well. And then last is the wheelchair tennis. 2 classes. They have open and quad class, where one is it's just more leg impairment, and the other one where arms might be impaired as well. And here you can see just the different, these were the sports at the Rio Games, and I think we hit most of them, just kind of showing you what different sports are available. And then here is from the 2014, I couldn't find a list for the new ones yet. Not quite obviously as many in winter, but kind of the same setup as the summer. Then to what I want to talk about is you hear about Special Olympics, you hear about the Olympics. I'll admit, you don't hear a ton about the Paralympics, and there are some reasons why you don't hear as much. Sometimes there's limited resources. There's lack of the proper media coverage. There's often misconceptions of the games and all the stories they have to be uplifting that they can't, that they just have to kind of go above and beyond for the uplifting. And sometimes people just don't think anyone's interested. What I found was interesting, at the Rio Games, there was 52 press credentials for the Paralympics for that year, but over 400 for the Olympics. So obviously the media is just not going to the game. What I did find too was sometimes a few articles said about the timing, that it happens 2 weeks after the Olympics and that it's not as much buzz and it's kind of died out. Some of the articles said about moving it before the Olympics, but there's this discussion on how to get more awareness for these games. Also, the public perception, just a cultural shift in how we view disabled athletes. Because a lot of these Paralympics, these athletes they're elite, they know what they're doing, but people don't see them as that. And also to the shift away from them being superhuman, because I think what they said too, they referred to it a few times as super cripple, that people can't relate really to them, and the common disabled person wouldn't be able to do the things, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And it's often confused with the Special Olympics, which we kind of separated those two. But grassroots organizations have stepped in to help with this awareness. Some of the benefits that I found when I kind of was reading some of it, it raises the public consciousness, our self-development, self-expression, especially for individuals who are disabled. It lets them know that those opportunities are out there. It gives us a place to overcome barriers and limitations. It sets the stage for the energy, confidence, enthusiasm, courage, and skill. Gives you awareness of the human potential, and it creates acceptance and mutual respect. The one article I found was Impact on the Disabled Youth. And really what it came out to was it does have a positive role. It doesn't necessarily all the time make the child go out and want to participate in sports, but if they can find someone that they relate to, they will definitely feel more, they will feel better about themselves. These Paralympics serve as a role model. And what I found when I read the article is that these young adults will kind of cling to the person who kind of resembles them. It also helps change the perception of the disabled individuals, and it motivates the disabled individuals to participate. And what one or two of the articles I found says, the more media coverage, their self-efficacy, they feel better about themselves, and when they can relate to the person, they're more willing to participate in the sports. The only thing I did find with this, and this has kind of been a theme with some of the other topics through this coursework, is some of the drawbacks. There's not a lot of opportunity to participate for some of these disabled. If you look around, like honestly, even my area, it would be hard to find some of the resources. I mean, you have to definitely go out and look for them. They're not there in front of you. And just those opportunities need to be promoted for these disabled youth. Well, that about sums up my presentation in Paralympics. These are my references. Thank you.